right, and we should be live here. Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm Thoughtful Money founder and host Adam Taggart, welcoming you here for a special report. We sadly had Israel launch a preemptive strike on Iran last night, taking the world by surprise. Here to make sense of it for us is RANE's Middle East expert, Ryan Bohl. We've had Ryan on the channel in the past before when there's been issues like this in the Middle East. So Ryan is going to tell us what's going on, how different last night's attack might be from the previous skirmishes we've seen in recent years between Israel and Iran, and then obviously trying to make sense for us what we should expect next and what the implications of all this might be. Ryan, thank you so much for taking time and what must be a very busy morning for you to talk to us.
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to be here. And yeah, I always cherish having these opportunities to engage with a wider audience beyond our client base.
All right. Well, look, I guess why don't we just start with the details? So what exactly has transpired in the past 15 hours?
So the Israelis have begun what we would call a strategic destruction campaign. And what we mean when we say that is that they are aiming to not just deter the Iranians. They're not aiming to just degrade some of their capabilities. They're aiming to destroy the Iranian nuclear program and its missile production capabilities. They are going on a full escalation against these two systems or these two institutions that are seen as the primary threat to Israel. And this is a massive step up the escalation ladder. It's always been something that we've considered as a possibility. And we've always kept it as one of our lower likelihood scenarios that Israel could suddenly jump to a strategic destruction campaign, more or less out of the blue. They had all the drivers there. It was a question of timing and whether or not they could get American buy-in to do so. But the timing, of course, it has caught us by surprise, in part because we expected that the U.S. wouldn't back such a campaign until the U.S.-Iran nuclear talks had formally collapsed. But those talks haven't collapsed formally. They're still on life support, but President Trump seems to have lost patience with them and gave the Israelis the yellow light or the green light, whatever you want to call it. Essentially, he's approved of these strikes, and it's very unlikely that the Americans didn't know about them beforehand. And so this has resulted in a target package of top leaders within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, nuclear scientists, missile bases, air defenses, and of course, at least one nuclear site in central Iran that has been struck repeatedly. And we're still waiting on whether or not the assessment, whether or not anything more than a surface building has been destroyed there. It's still very unclear. So at least one nuclear location has been struck. There doesn't appear to be any radiation leak or contamination because of that attack. And we are, assessing that. And now what we are doing is we are waiting for the Iranian major retaliation. They've already launched about 100 drones toward Israel. Most of those were shot down long before they reached Israeli airspace. We're waiting for the ballistic missiles. With the Iran's still formidable arsenal of large missiles that they will eventually use against Israel. And then it's our question of what do they choose to target? And is that going to be an airbase like they have in the past? Is it going to be institutions like Mossad or the Ministry of Defense, which are located in Tel Aviv? Or is it going to be some other target sets, Israeli energy facilities, Israeli cities, the Knesset itself, other targets that would be much more escalatory if they choose to go in that direction?
Okay, so a number of questions here. From an escalation standpoint, in the U.S. with nuclear missiles, we've got DEFCON 5 all the way down to DEFCON 1, right? DEFCON 1 being like this is high alert, right? As I understand it, in the past when Iran and Israel have disagreed and it's become kinetic, they've the targets have been either proxies, right? So like embassies in Syria, that type of thing, or when Israel's gone into Iran, it hasn't gone after the underbelly. It hasn't gone after the nuclear sites. It hasn't really gone into Tehran much, right? It was stuff on the outskirts of the country that sent a message, but weren't particularly visible to the average Iranian citizen. Now, obviously, they're trying to send a much more hard message here, right? We sort of like we saw with Hezbollah. Right, Hezbollah. I think I've got that right. Where they decapitated a lot of its leadership in one, fell swoop with those strikes with the exploding pagers. Here they've targeted high-level members of the Iranian military. They've, were hitting specific floors of specific apartment buildings in Tehran to take them out. They've gone after nuclear facilities this time. So I guess my question is like, is there a line that we've crossed here? Did last night's strike cross a line escalation-wise, where this is not going to be sort of a tit for tat? We're trying to sort of send messages and puff up our chests and look like we're doing something for our citizenry, but we're not really getting that serious. Is this now much more serious given the style of these attacks?
Yeah, this is the most serious crisis we've ever had between Israel and Iran. And the word war has been thrown around a lot. There have been rumors that Iran will actually formally declare war on the Israelis. Whether or not they do, it might be a little bit irrelevant in terms of Iran's response. But this is the war scenario. This is what it looked like. This is what every serious observer of the Middle East has been waiting to see unfold for up to 15 years. And it's finally happened. And the reason it hadn't happened prior to this is for two reasons. One, Iran doesn't really have very many good options in the war scenario, and has always lacked good options in the war scenario, and has worked very hard ever since Israel started making noise about its nuclear program back in the 1990s to avoid this scenario. Hence the reason that their attacks last October and last April in 2024 were gauged to allow Israel to get off of the escalation ladder, because Iran doesn't do well on the escalation ladder against Israel, and certainly not against the United States. For that matter, the Israelis, for many, many years, going back to 2006, have been worried that if they attacked the Iranian nuclear program directly, the way that they did with Iraq in 1982, and they did with Syria in 2007, and they destroyed those nuclear programs in single strikes, they were worried that Iran's proxies, as well as Iran's missiles, were strong enough to overwhelm Israeli air defenses and really impose significant harm on the civilian populations. And they were very worried that the U.S. wouldn't back them on a campaign like this. So they had two major constraints to escalation. So both sides had constraints that kept them from going and crossing this line. And what's happened over the past year and a half or so is that the constraints on Israel have eased to the point where they no longer exist. President Trump was elected in November 2024. He is very pro-Israel. He is very anti-Iran nuclear program. And he is very risk-prone. He's willing to take risks to break static paradigms. And it looks like in this case, what he's assessed, or at least his intelligence team has assessed, is that Israel can take the brunt of the risk here, that Iran will only strike Israel. It won't strike the Strait of Hormuz. It won't strike energy facilities. Essentially, this is Israel's problem, not America's problem. And that's probably why he was sold on it, is that belief that Iran doesn't want to expand the war. For that matter, Iran's network of proxies and deterrents have all been degraded or eliminated over the past year and a half. Syria's government, that was the forward operating base for the Iranian militias and the IRGC, it's gone. Now it is an anti-Iran provisional government. Hezbollah was defanged last fall in the war that it fought with Israel, where its top leadership, like you noted, was assassinated in strikes that were supposed to kick off, the worst war that Lebanon has ever seen, and didn't. Instead, it resulted in Hezbollah being diminished and defeated. And now Hezbollah is on a trajectory where they may be forced to disarm or change their ideology to survive. And then, of course, the airstrikes on Iran last fall also hit Iran's air defenses and proved to the Israelis that regardless of what Iran says about their air defenses, they could not control their own airspace. Israel has full air dominance over that country and has since at least the fall of 2024. And with all those pieces in place, it really was a question of when Israel would strike Iran, not if. And the big question was, would Iran see these factors and come to the nuclear talks with Iran or with the United States and say, we can see that the strategic situation has turned against us. We don't have good options. We're ready to negotiate and give up our nuclear program on your terms. And they were choosing not to do that. They were trying to delay and bide for time. And the Trump administration lost patience with that and gave the Israelis the green light that they had been waiting for at least 6 months, possibly longer.
Okay, so we'll talk in a moment about what this might do to the rest of the Middle East and who it might pull into Iran's side. But if this remains an Iran versus Israel kinetic conflict, what are the capabilities there? Who has the stronger hand? You just mentioned that Israel kind of has air dominance over Iran. Is this actually, if Israel were to do this, is this a good time for Israel to be pressing like this, or is there more to the Iran threat than is appreciated at this time?
There's, in terms of what Iran can do to Israel, because Israel has air superiority. It has, a substantial air force of around 300 combat aircraft, and about supposedly up to 200 of them were utilized in the first wave. Israel's major constraints are logistic and diplomatic. They can carry out the military campaign as long as they have a supply line from the United States that will continue to give them the bombs that they need, and will continue to reassure their security in case of Iran's massive barrage of ballistic missiles, that the U.S. will be involved in those interceptions. Israel can keep that up. And diplomatically, they need their relationship with the United States to remain strong, because Israel's politicians, in fact, Israelis in general, are very conservative, small c, meaning that they are always very, very wary of risk. That's why this is kind of out of the norm for mainstream Israeli behavior. They're taking a huge risk right now because they believe the situation is intolerable. So if they believe their relationship with the U.S. is weakening, or that the U.S. is losing patience with this campaign, that's a major constraint to further Israeli action. On the Iranian side, they still have a significant ballistic missile arsenal. The amount that they fire and the scale that they carry it out, and the sort of targets that they choose, will define whether or not these missiles get through and what kind of targets they actually hit. It would make some strategic sense that the first salvo once more goes for Israeli air bases, which are involved in this campaign. The idea is to knock out the Israeli Air Force, or render its airports inoperable, slow down the pace of strikes. That would be the thing that would make the most tactical sense. But because Israel has assassinated senior leadership within the IRGC, it is possible that these folks are going to be arguing that Iran needs to go and escalate as well. It needs to hit a Mossad facility somewhere. It needs to kill Israeli spies. It needs to kill senior Israeli leaders. It could go after the secure bunker that the Israeli leadership typically goes to in crises like this. And some of those places are near civilian centers, which means there's a strong possibility that missiles this time kill a significant number of Israeli civilians. So that's what we're waiting for, is this next step. Is will the Iranians use their still potent capabilities? They've obviously been hobbled. They've been disorganized, but they can still fire their missiles at scale at Israel. And now it's just a question of what target they choose.
Okay. And Israel has demonstrated over recent years, they can be very surgical in their attacks, right? Finding out where the opposition leaders are, taking them out in all sorts of creative ways. Has Iran demonstrated a similar opportunity? Like you said, they might go after specific leaders. Do they have that surgical ability?
No, Iran has a professional disadvantage, both in intelligence and in organization, for its Quds force, its IRGC people that it deploys abroad. Iran has an advantage over Israel in that Iran is very casualty tolerant. It can take large losses, and its political system is unaffected. Whereas Israel, if one Israeli pilot is shot down over Iran, this is going to be a major problem for the Israeli government. Whereas if one Iranian general is killed, it's an embarrassment for the Iranian government, but they will continue on with their existing policies, and it won't result in, say, the possibility of the Iranian government dissolving. So that's a really big problem that the Iranians have, is that they're willing to take losses, but they have they don't have a great counterintelligence ability to halt the Israelis from striking their top leadership. So if they're going to try to kill, say, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that is something that they will have to do by luck. It won't be something they can carry out with precision. And this is in contrast to what we now know. Mossad had bases inside of Iran. They were probably pretty makeshift bases, but they were building drones inside of Iran that were used in the first wave of strikes. This is remarkable that Mossad was able to operate so openly inside of Iranian borders, and it goes to show how poor Iran's counterintelligence capabilities really are. It's impossible to see the IRGC setting up a drone base inside of Israel itself and conducting a similar operation to try to assassinate somebody.
Okay, so from a stylistic standpoint, seems like Israel has much more surgical capabilities. Iran, whatever they do, is going to be more sort of brute force.
Right. Yes, exactly. And the willingness to take political and diplomatic backlash, and to know that Europeans are going to criticize them no matter what, America is going to criticize them no matter what. So if they decide to resurrect some of these more abhorrent tactics like suicide bombers, abroad, they would be willing to absorb that diplomatic blow because they don't have many other better options.
Okay, and you made that contrast that Iran can kind of absorb the the reputational damage. You know, uh, I have heard of late, I don't know if this is accurate, which is why I'm asking the question, that the Iranian leaders, you know, may not have as much of a grip over the general populace today as they've enjoyed over the past or exercised over the past couple of decades, meaning there may be less tolerance amongst the general populace if they start seeing that, you know, Iran really is starting to lose in some very visible way. Is there any accuracy to that, or are they still, you know, is their iron grip still pretty firm?
Well, there are probably two dynamics. Is that this is an unpopular government, and we know that because after Ibrahim Raisi died last year in that helicopter crash, the Iranian president, and he was a hardliner. A reformer was elected in a low turnout election that the government tried to manipulate away from the reformers, and the reformers still won. And that is a sign that the Iranian public, even those few who turn out to vote, who are supposed to be the loyalists, really aren't in a mood for confrontation. They really just want to get on with their lives. There have been other signs, like the morality police are less visible in cities like Tehran. Women are going around without the hijab on. The morality police isn't harassing people as often in these more liberal, within the Iranian context, cities. So there is a sign that the government is easing up on its more repressive domestic policies, because it knows that they're unpopular and because it's worried about its domestic legitimacy going forward. But that being said, I have yet to meet a large number of people who will cheer on a rival bombing their country. Right now, Iranians will rally to the flag. They may not like this government, but it's their government. It's theirs to criticize. It's theirs to pull down, not Israel's. And so the supreme leader and the IRGC will probably be enjoying at least a short-term popularity boost. And whether or not that popularity sticks around will depend on whether or not their counterattack against Israel basically goes to that core of the addressing the dignity of the Iranian people. And I don't think we have the answer to that right now in terms of what the outcome is going to be on that front. But we do know that the Iranians are still the government is very much still firmly in control of events on the ground. The Basij is still there. The IRGC is still there. The system is still coup-proofed, and the elites have not split. If the elites don't split, and the army and the Revolutionary Guard don't split, there is no chance for an uprising to topple this government anytime soon.
Okay. And as you talked about, the U.S. is a critical supplier of Israel, you know, in this confrontation. Historically, Russia has been a big supplier of Iran. Of course, Russia is embroiled in the Ukraine war right now. Do we have a sense right now about Russia's capabilities and appetite for supporting Iran as much as the U.S. may be supporting Israel in this?
Well, they are, and it's a good point, but it's a good point to bring up to contrast how different those relationships are. Russia views Iran opportunistically. It does not favor an Iranian nuclear weapon and never has. It doesn't want anybody besides Russia to have nuclear weapons. That doesn't work for Russia. And it does not want the Iranians to be too independent and picking wars that drag Russia into those wars that aren't in their interest. And of course, they were not too long ago neighbors back as the Soviet Union, and the Soviets were trying to expand their influence into Iran. Iran has not forgotten that. So many Iranian nationalists are always wary of Russian influence and Russian ties. One of the remarkable things is that there are no Russian bases inside of Iran. There's no air bases, no troops, in spite of their defense ties. And there's no mutual security clause in their security partnership agreement that they signed not too terribly long ago. There's no pledge for them to come to the defense of the other because they're both worried about being dragged into wars that aren't in their interest. And it's very different with the U.S. The U.S. is a hegemon. Israel is one of its periphery states that serves some of America's interests, and America supplies it because it has the power to do so. Russia is still, it's a great power, but it's limited, and it can't supply and support Iran in an open-ended way the way the U.S. can with Israel. So with those distinctions being made, the Russians are going to be pushing very hard at the UN for a ceasefire. They will be trying to take advantage of this to turn the narrative on the West over the Ukraine war. Now, look, the Israelis are the aggressors. Look, we knew it. The neocons are back. They will be propagandizing this as much as possible. And then in the aftermath of this, it's a big question of how much they take advantage of Iran's inevitable chaos after this. Because like I said, Iran doesn't have very many good options coming out of this war. It's choosing to lose by different degrees and then rebuilding after that defeat and trying to build the narrative that they actually won in secret. Well, how do the Russians take advantage of that? Do they finally push for a Russian airbase inside of Iran, which is something they've wanted for a long time? Do they push for Iran's energy industry to be more closely coordinated to Russia's energy industry so they're less competitors and more collaborators? Or do they demand that the Iranians start sending troops and fighters to the Ukraine front where they desperately need troops, like they have with the North Koreans, if Russia is going to provide arms to the Iranians? And so those are bigger questions, is whether or not Iran emerges from this diminished, and will they end up being pulled into Russia's orbit because they don't have very many good options in the aftermath.
Okay, so look, if Russia is not quite the actively engaged supplier that the U.S. is here, and Israel has the upper hand, it seems, in terms of military capability here. In a moment, we'll talk about what other players in the Mideast theater might do here. But is this? I mean, I think one could make the argument that this might actually be the right time to apply pressure to Iran to try to drive them back to the negotiating table to strike the overall deal that Trump is looking for here. Is this cold, calculated math likely to work, or is this a big mistake?
It is. There is a fair bit of uncertainty right now because the decimation that Israel has managed on Iran's top leadership, we don't have clean data as to who's going to be replacing those folks. And so if it's hardliners that are taking over, it means Iran will now be formally on a path to a nuclear weapon. Before, they were never formally on that path. They were always hinting that they would go in that direction. But it's very likely that if hardliners are replacing this leadership and they have the upper hand in Tehran, Iran's going to race for a nuclear weapon in some capacity. And maybe that nuclear test is something they do with the Russians down the road, if that's something that they choose to try to explore. And they will be looking for other ways of having deterrence against the Israelis. And that could involve more extreme measures, like a resumption of suicide bombings against civilians in countries like Argentina and the United States. That's something they could consider doing if the hardliners have the upper hand. On the other hand, if you have more of a pragmatists that are coming to the table and they're saying, this is putting us on the path to becoming the next Saddam Hussein. Any way we retaliate only deepens our isolation. It alienates us from our neighbors. It creates a coalition that's going to eventually want to overthrow us. And we need to compromise now to save ourselves. If those folks are coming to power, they're getting the attention of the Supreme Leader Khamenei right now, that means that the deal is probably back on the table. But it's really hard to see them having any say until Iran has gone through at least a few escalation and retaliation cycles with Israel. They have to strike back at Israel. They have to cause significant damage to the Israelis. They can sell the domestic narrative that they struck back. And then it's a question of when this all calms down, because Israel's not going to carry out this war open-endedly, like for another year, the way they have with Gaza. Instead, they'll carry out a target set, destroy those targets, and then we'll move into a new status quo. And in the aftermath of that status quo, if the pragmatists have the upper hand, then there is a chance for a nuclear deal of some capacity, but it would be on America's terms, on Israel's terms, not on Iran's.
Okay, so President Trump was over in the Middle East just a couple of weeks ago, came back with a whole bunch of deals that were promised. It really seemed like a dawn of a new era of U.S. Mideast relations there. What are the other people in the Mideast theater, or the other countries in the Mideast theater? What are their likely responses to this to be? Are they going to want to pressure Iran to, hey, let's just calm things down, everybody? Or is there a philosophical, look, you attacked one of our own and we're going to be on Team Iran?
Yeah, so and I think there's a couple of dynamics that we can think about. There's a difference between the governments of these regions and the public. Only Israel and Turkey are functional democracies, and Turkey's democracy is kind of dysfunctional. But nevertheless, in places like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, even places like Iraq, the popular will is not really expressed through the political system very well. So the opinion of the public is different than the calculus of the state. In regards to nearly all of the countries in the region, nearly all of them want to stay out of this. Jordan is stuck where it has to have its airspace being used by Iranian missiles and Israeli jets, and it just hopes that those don't fall on its people the way that it did last fall, where somebody was actually killed in Jordan because of a falling Iranian missile. So Jordan is stuck in the middle, Syria is stuck in the middle, and Iraq is stuck in the middle, and they are observers to this chaos that's unfolding above their heads. because they don't have the ability to really stop it. They don't have the diplomatic or military ability to interdict this back and forth that's going on. But if they're not in the way, places like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, they all want this to come to an end as quickly as possible, as long as it doesn't result in damage to their own countries. They don't want to be dragged into it themselves. The Saudis, some years ago, about 5-6 years ago, made the conclusion that being hawkish and aggressive wasn't working for them, that it was undermining their Vision 2030 diversification strategy, and they moved away from it. And they've stayed in that place ever since. So all these countries, they want this to calm down. But that being said, there are countries like the United Arab Emirates where President Mohammed bin Zayed is probably cheering this on, is probably pretty pleased to see the Iranians finally taken down a peg or two. But while that's probably the private case, I would suspect very strongly the Emirati government will never make a single mention of the fact that they are still opposed to Iran's nuclear program, as they're desperate to keep the Iranians from sending a missile their way.
Okay, but it sounds like you're saying most other players in the and certainly players of influence in the Mideast theater are probably rooting for a peace deal just to have this thing quiet down. And should we assume that they will put through their own back channels some pressure on Iran to take the deal?
Yeah, but they're limited in the kind of pressure they can use. Qatar is one country with some influence with the Iranians. They're major trade partners, and the Emiratis also have some trade relations with the Iranians, so they could try to leverage to get the Iranians to a truce of some kind. But we're now in the worst case scenario in terms of our escalation scenarios for Israel. This is as full tilt as we imagine the Israelis would ever realistically go. And with that said, Iran just can't be in the mood anytime soon to sacrifice its security, its political persona, its ideology for trade relations with its neighbors. So countries like Qatar and Turkey and the United Arab Emirates will probably all try to mediate an end to this war. But it's much like Russia and Ukraine. Once this conflict has now been opened up, the two actors themselves have to decide to walk away from it, and external actors have very limited influence. Big exception being, the U.S. can shut this down tomorrow if it says to the Israelis, you're no longer getting resupplied, and we've run out of patience on this. No sign of that happening, but that is the one major exception.
Okay, and is that a lever here where, I don't know whether it's through overt or back channels, where the U.S. can basically tell Iran, we can make this end, just to come back to the peace negotiating table, and we'll pressure Israel to stand down?
I don't even think it's through the background. I think Trump's Truth Social posts have all suggested very clearly, if Iran comes back to the negotiating table, this can all end. Like say, I think he was using the words like "save the Persian Empire while you can." It's very overt that this is the tactic, that they're using military force to bring the Iranians back to the table to sign a deal they don't want to sign. And it's a question of whether or not the Iranians believe they can endure this, because the problem with air power is very, very good at destroying stationary targets like buildings and knocking out conventional armies like masses of tanks. But once it's out of those targets, what do the Israelis really do in Iran? Do they just keep bombing the same locations over and over again while the Iranian government goes to ground and learns to adapt to that and just wears out the Israelis the way the Houthis wore out the United States earlier this spring? That's an open question, because there will be Iranians who will argue, we can put up with an air campaign for 10 years, 50 years, 100 years. Eventually, the Israelis will run out of bombs. We'll never run out of bodies. And we'll rebuild our nuclear program once Israel's political will to keep this war going runs out.
So a couple of things on that, and I probably should have started with this. You said that Israel had been chomping at the bit for at least 6 months to do this, and it was the U.S. that was holding the leash and not letting him do it, and then President Trump took him off the leash. Why the urgency here? Why is? I mean, I listened to Netanyahu last night, so I think I've got a decent idea. But from you, like, why was Israel saying, "Look, we have to go this big now," or even yesterday?
Well, I think for the Israelis, it's been waiting that American green light, and they finally got it. Now, why did the Americans change their position? It seems to be exhaustion with.
Sorry, let's that in more on the Israeli side. Mm-hmm. Why are they chomping at the bit?
Because they have believed for a very long time that Iran's nuclear program was on the cusp of weaponization. But what changed last December was Assad fell. That opened up a vast airspace to allow attacks against Iran. Now, Israel doesn't have to bomb Syria first to get to Iran. Syria is no longer a factor. And the Iranians that were in Syria, that were going to conduct attacks against Israel in response to Iran, they're all gone. They all went home. They also defeated Hezbollah. Hezbollah can't saturate northern Israel with thousands of rockets like they threatened to before the fall 2024 war. So with those two major hurdles removed, they were just waiting for the Americans to say, yes, you have the opportunity, go for it now. There's only so much Iran can do to you. Basically, it's like watching, if you were thinking about, a land war, it's like two of the land fronts just suddenly collapsed for the Iranians. And it now has taken all that military pressure off the Israelis on their northern frontier and allowed them to really move against the Iranians without fear of significant retaliation.
Okay. This might be a little bit too tangential, but I'm just curious. Israel obviously has been heavily embroiled in Gaza, that whole issue there. They did remove a lot of the other fronts that was occupying Israel. Do they have the bandwidth to pursue this versus Iran while still dealing with the Gaza situation?
For a limited time, yeah, I think they do. And they are two different types of wars. This is an air war and a missile war against the Iranians, and they don't have to worry about a ground front of it. So that makes a big difference in the war wariness factor, which Israel is very war wary right now. Gaza is a ground war, and there's all kinds of political problems as a result of that. But Hamas's rocket arsenal doesn't exist anymore. They can fire a couple here and there. And that was also a factor that mattered, is that once Hamas was removed as a rocket force on Israel's border, that removed yet another constraint to Israeli attacks against Iran, because it was always assumed that Hamas would join in a war as well. But there's a political question here, because how much more conflict can ordinary Israelis, put up with before they decide they've had enough? And on Wednesday, Netanyahu's government was within a hair's breadth of collapsing over the draft issue. The ultra-Orthodox Jews in the country don't serve, they get exemptions. They almost pulled down the government. He probably pulled them aside and said, hey, we're going to attack Iran tomorrow. I need this government to last. And that's probably what saved his government that last minute. But that's because there aren't enough combat soldiers to keep fighting this endlessly. And a lot of Israeli soldiers are complaining about PTSD, and they're needing mental health treatment, and they don't want to go back into Gaza endlessly. So how long can Israeli pilots run these missions against Iran? It's 1,000 miles there and back. How long can they do that before the fatigue gets in, before the PTSD gets in, before an accident happens and a pilot has to eject over a hostile country and that demoralizes the force? Those are things that I think the Israelis will have to deal with in the long term, which is why Netanyahu is talking about this weeks, because I think that he knows that there's only so much time that his own forces and public will tolerate an extended campaign against a big country like Iran.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. This means nothing, but I've spent some time over in Israel. I'm sure you've spent way more than me there. It's a country where people live with a pervasive sense that an attack could happen at any time, right? And everybody does national service there, and it's very prominent. When you walk around, you can see everybody, soldiers everywhere. So I would think for a population, I mean, obviously you get ground down after a while, but for a population, they probably have a very high tolerance for continued threats, just because it's sort of all they know when they live there. I wonder on the Iran side, if the population feels the same way, if there was a prolonged, military campaign between both countries, which citizenry would tire first. But Iran certainly has numbers on its side, so
Yeah, it's a game of political wills that it's hard to assess right now. Except, the Israeli side, it's easier to assess through its political system, which is, we know that the Netanyahu government is very unpopular, and they will probably lose the next election, and that's in part because of their security policies. So that's a question: is will the next Israeli government be able to take up the mantle and keep these wars going, or will they be pushed into, calling it in different places like Gaza and Iran? But another real problem for the Israelis is, again, there's only so many targets they can strike. They bombed Syria for 10 years before the Assad government fell. They never did knock out Syria's air defenses completely, in spite of a decade of bombing. It's tricky to do this from the air over and over and over again. What brought down Assad was internal factors, rebels that did it on their own without the Israelis necessarily interfering. So that's what the Israelis need, is they need to see Iran's political will break in some capacity. But if it doesn't, their military abilities to change facts on the ground will eventually run out of facts to change.
Okay, so let me ask you this. So, for Iran here, you know, it's motivate. I mean, the motivation for the leadership there, right, is obviously to stay in power, right, to continue their grip. It sounds like their capabilities have been eroding, right, and their allies have been kind of fallen, especially in recent years. They don't seem to have a ton of support from their neighbors there. So, and America has been involved in trying to get this deal struck with them. What is the potential here for the bear hug, the charm offensive, right? Which is like, hey, you can keep going back and forth with Israel here, and you can just attrite each other, and it can be not fun, or you come to the peace table, that stops, but then, man, you guys make some reforms, open up, commit that you're not going to enrich uranium. Hey, we start making investments. We and a lot of other people start making investments in your country, and the money starts pouring in, and it starts getting a lot more fun. That's I think sort of standard Trump, right? That's what he's trying to do, create a win-win deal out of all this. Is it possible to strike a win-win deal with Iran, or when it's an ideologically driven country like that, is it different? Are they not motivated by the same things?
Yeah, I think what you're describing is the Gorbachev scenario, finding an Iranian Gorbachev and having what Reagan did to him to convince him to reform, and then eventually the Soviet Union went away. And even Obama, when he was signing his nuclear deal, kind of hinted that that was the long-term strategy, is that we want to get Iran to a comfortable enough position where its hardliners no longer have an argument for their security policies and their domestic policies, and eventually Iran becomes a quote-unquote normal country that's not a threat to its neighbors anymore. That is very hard to see happening under fire. If the United States had been, bombing the Soviet Union in the late 80s, it's very hard to imagine somebody like Gorbachev coming to power on that backdrop. The reformists exist in Iran, and they very much want to change certain things, but their core opposition to American military power, to Israeli military power, to hegemony, etc., those are very hard things for them to walk away from, particularly in moments like this. This is going to reinforce Iranian nationalism rather than weaken it. So while Trump is going to say, we can make everything okay if you just give up your program and normalize with us, etc., for many people inside the government, that's kind of the death kiss. It means that, yes, you might get the Americans off your back, but then you're opening yourself up to the coup from the only forces that really could overthrow the system, which is the Revolutionary Guard or the Basij or hardliners within the political cabinet. Those are the folks that you're really scared about, because you're sharing a room with them, as opposed to the United States, or the Israelis, who, yeah, they can carry out airstrikes, but eventually those airstrikes have to come to an end. Whereas with the hardliner in the house down the street from you, you have to live with that guy, and you know what he believes in. So that's a tricky part, is how do you, an external force usually has very limited success in reshaping a country's internal ideology, let alone its political dynamics. It's usually the locals themselves that are driving those dynamics, and then an outsider exploits them. CIA can't just start a propaganda campaign saying, hey, Iran, everybody, if you join democracy, everything will be okay. Iranians won't do that on their own unless they're already predisposed to have that position. And it's very unlikely that they want to embrace the West while there's airstrikes going on across their country.
Okay, well, that makes sense. All right, well, so as we're talking here, one, we have yet to see what we believe to be the full Iranian response beyond the drones that you mentioned earlier. We do see that oil is up substantially for the day. It's up about 5% right now. It was up a lot more overnight. What implications do you foresee right now, given the fog of war that's currently there, on oil markets from here?
And I'm kind of paraphrasing from the oil traders that I've been hearing throughout the day, but basically they're looking for an actual change in supply. So far, nobody's energy facilities have been hit. Iran's haven't been, Israel's haven't been, none of the GCC ones have. The Strait of Hormuz is untouched. Unless oil supplies themselves are actually hit. Right now, this is kind of like risk premiums that they're putting in here. A little bit of gouging that they can get away with it for some of these more adventurous traders. But the idea of getting oil over $100, $130, $150 a barrel will only happen if supplies start to get disrupted. And so we need to see somebody either say or do those attacks on the supplies. And so far, We haven't hit that yet. In fact, Israel hasn't even hit all of Iran's nuclear program targets yet. They're probably working their way there, but they haven't even finished that. And they would want to destroy the nuclear program as much as possible before they moved on to a strategic destruction campaign against Iran's energy sector. And that's where you would see the oil spike start to take place, because then if Israel is hitting Iran's energy systems and energy facilities, it suggests that Iran has to retaliate against other energy powers in the region. Israel doesn't really have a whole lot. So the implication would be they go after the Strait of Hormuz, or they go after Saudi or the UAE or something like that. So good for the oil traders. They're looking at fundamentals.
Okay. So is it pretty safe to assume that as Israel is continuing to conduct what it's doing, that there are phone calls coming from DC to Tehran saying, hey, look, it'd be terrible if they had moved on from your uranium program to starting to blow up your oil fields. Let's give us some incentive here to tell these guys to stand down.
Yeah, and I think that the signals are probably being sent along those lines, particularly from Europeans, and the Gulf Arabs are almost certainly also working the phones with the Iranians and saying, you have to retaliate. Yeah, we get that. Once you do that and make sure that you make your targets something that Israel can walk away from, let's try to turn the page on this as much as possible. Reality is, I think that the Iranians would take a status quo ante as soon as possible. It's really the Israelis that are the ones who are pushing escalation because they have the advantage right now. If the Iranians aren't essentially willing to surrender to the Israelis on multiple fronts, from missile programs to proxies to their nuclear program, I think that the Netanyahu government is going to work through its target set before they start to think about de-escalation.
Okay, and that's what I was going to ask. Do you think they're kind of going scorched earth, at least on the nuclear uranium enrichment program, or just everything they knew about? Let's just take those off the map now, all of them?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's what they're going to work their way through, is to destroy as much of the nuclear program as they can. And they're going to be knocking out air defenses so that they can suggest that if Iran, doesn't comply with whatever it agrees to, they'll come back and resume airstrikes because Iran can't stop them. They're also trying to destroy the missiles and the production facilities and fuel and depots and launchers to make it so Iran's deterrence is weakened. They essentially want Iran in a position like Hezbollah is in right now. Hezbollah is very cowed. Its leadership shows up routinely on television. They're literally sweating because they're worried that the Israelis are overhead. That's what they want Iran's leadership. But again, Iran's a bigger country, much deeper leadership. Ranks and a lot of these folks have never experienced war, not since the 1980s. So unlike with Hezbollah, where there was some wariness about what Israel can do to them, I think there's some real resilience within Iran's system that is willing to endure the damage that the Israelis can do, at least in the near term.
Okay. All right. So in beginning to wrap up here, Ryan, and thank you again so much for coming and making yourself available for us on a situation that's so still unfolding in real time here. Again, we haven't seen Iran's real response here. What do you think is, I'm asking you to guess with very little hard data here. What do you think is the most likely progression we're likely to see from here?
I think so. I won't reframe it as likely. I'll say strategically wise versus politically driven.
Okay.
Those two dynamics. So the strategically wise choice for the Iranians is to strike Israel military to military, because that keeps it within the proportional box. It doesn't give the United States an excuse to intervene. It allows them to try to destroy the Israeli Air Force and degrade Mossad and humiliate the Ministry of Defense. That's something that makes the most sense. And that is what they did last year, is they focused on military targets so that they wouldn't have civilian casualties. Because remember, many Israelis are also Americans. If any of them are killed, then that can create the rationale for the United States to intervene. So they want to avoid that from a strategic standpoint. They don't want to bring the Americans into the war, and they certainly don't want to do something like close the Strait of Hormuz or attack Gulf Arab targets, because as soon as they do that, they're the next Saddam Hussein now. Now they've gone full Saddam. They're a pariah. They'll be isolated for at least the medium term. And regime change suddenly becomes something that other countries are talking about. So they avoid those decisions if they are strategically driven, if they're looking at all the factors as a holistic picture. But their top leadership is being assassinated. That's extremely personal. It would be very hard for anybody to not want revenge under those circumstances. The legitimacy blow that they're being given because of the destruction of their prestige nuclear program also demands a political response. So if they are politically driven, they expand their target sets beyond military sites. They target civilian locations inside of Israel. They target civilian infrastructure like energy facilities. They use their cyber weapons to try to poison the water or destroy sewer systems or shut down schools and websites throughout Israel. And they go as scorched earth as they can on the Israelis out of a feeling of revenge. And then that feeling of revenge could extend to, well, this isn't possible without the Americans. We target the U.S. base in Iraq. We target the U.S. embassy in Iraq. We target U.S. bases throughout the region in different scopes and scales of the retaliation cycles to punish the Americans. And then finally, to break America's political will to support this war, we threaten the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Iran can't shut down it, like literally, but we've already seen how oil ships and others would react to the threat of harassment. They would simply stop going. So all Iran has to do is say, we're going to start shooting at occasional ships that are linked to Israel in the Strait of Hormuz, and then all the tankers will be grounded, and they'll have to start going overland through the UAE or across Saudi Arabia to get that oil out there. That causes your energy shock. Maybe it spooks President Trump, who's very sensitive to gas prices, but maybe it also causes the U.S. to decide to intervene against Iran directly, like they did with the Houthis. But again, if you're revenge-based, if you're politically based, that's where your mind goes. I tend to think, given Iran's history, that they will react strategically, but this has never happened to them. And it's certainly the most egregious infringement of their sovereignty since Saddam invaded in 1980. And their reaction to Saddam's invasion was political. They fought a war that was far longer and far more painful than they needed to because they had a politically driven ideological strategy. And if that's where they go back to, then I think we're looking at much more disruptions.
Gosh, well, let's hope that's not the case. But if it does escalate in that way, where it gets to the point of American direct retaliation against Iran, how much of a Rubicon is that once that happens?
That is, so it would definitely be an air war again. The U.S. is not positioned to invade Iran. And the U.S. has significant air assets that'd be able to hit more targets than the Israelis could. It would be the destruction of a lot of both military and civilian infrastructure in Iran. It would set them back a decade, maybe decades, in terms of like bridges and electricity and missile sites and command centers. It would be a major blow to them. But because the great Satan, so to speak, is getting involved directly, it might also be a legitimacy boost, at least for the hardliners, allowing them to say, look, we told you they were out to get us. Now they actually are. You have no choice but to look to us for salvation and protection. So if we go down that route, we could end up in a situation similar to the 90s, where it was with Saddam Hussein's Iraq, where it's a tense relationship, violence erupts occasionally, but the outside pressure strengthens the hardliners inside of the regime, lets them stay in control. But the air campaigns degrade Iran's ability to be a threat to their neighbors and keeps them contained. And then we get stuck in a stalemate that suggests that things like, the Strait of Hormuz is occasionally interrupted, that Iranian-backed terrorism takes place across the world, and that the U.S. gets dragged into intermittent air campaigns to punish Iran for this behavior over the years or even decades.
And would Russia sit on the sidelines and just watch that, or is this something that would pull Russia in more actively?
I think Russia would be thrilled to mediate an end to this kind of conflict, like they tried to with Syria multiple times. Because the U.S. is so war weary itself, and we're actually seeing a split in Trump's base over these Israeli attacks, I think that the Russians would like to take advantage of that and tell the Trump administration, hey, we'll go in, we'll guarantee that uranium does whatever you want, and in exchange, you call off the airstrikes. That may be something that the Russians and the Americans could come to an agreement to. It's a really hard thing to imagine that the Iranians would do that, unless, again, they were moving into a pragmatic position where they recognize they need some sort of great power sponsor to protect them. The Russians are their best bet. China's not going to send their military. So therefore, they have to give the Russians what they want and allow themselves to be pulled into that Russian sphere of influence.
Okay. And if the U.S. got pulled in this way, which hopefully it doesn't, where would Europe be? Would there be another coalition of the willing like we had in Iraq, or would this be, look, America, this is your deal?
This is America on its own. And it would depend, of course, what the Iranians decided to strike, because if they decide to carry out an attack like they did in 2020 against the American airbase in Iraq, the U.S. could just strike those locations that were involved in the attack and then call it a day. And then Iran could call it a day from there too, while the Israel-Iran war continues. On the other hand, if Strait of Hormuz or energy facilities are attacked, then the U.S. gets stuck in a more open-ended campaign like we saw with the Houthis, where essentially the two sides wore each other out over this spring. The Americans were like, we're not making military progress, and this is too expensive. and the Houthis were saying to themselves, we'd rather focus on Israel, and we, of course, want to preserve our good relations with Iran, who wants to have a de-escalation with the Americans so the nuclear talks can take place. So we could have a situation like that where the two of them are testing each other's political wills to keep up like a freedom of navigations operation in the Red Sea.
Okay. All right. I'm wrapping up here. Last major question. So let's assume this goes the way we all hope for, right? Which is Iran, it's probably going to do, some retaliation that it needs to do, but then it ends from there. And let's say Iran comes back to the table with the US and we end up with a deal, and that lets all sorts of new things potentially flourish, right? How good for that would that be for the US? What would that potentiality unlock?
If there is a nuclear deal, there's kind of like two ways to think about it. There's the ideal US nuclear deal where Iran doesn't enrich uranium and is essentially defanged. And that's kind of suggesting that Iran suddenly switches to a reform path, which, like I said, it's hard to see at the moment. The other path is that the Iranians agree to a deal and then secretly race for a bomb. And they do something similar to what North Korea did, where, again, they're trying to buy time and they're trying to use threats and deterrence and guile to eventually get to the point where they actually have a nuclear weapon. Because I think for many Iranian strategic thinkers, this scenario is showcasing to them why they need a bomb, and they need a bomb sooner rather than later because they're not secure without it. So those are the kind of scenarios you can see. And I think the one that's more likely is that Iran signs a deal and then tries to cheat. And whether or not they get caught and then it results in another escalation is an open question, rather than Iran ending up with a deal where they're pragmatic, they're going to be a good neighbor from now on. It's hard to see that happening under this current war scenario.
Okay. I guess last question on this too is how realistic is it to build kind of a skunk works nuclear bomb program? With the Israelis watching as close as they are, with their ability to come in surgically and destroy stationary targets, can you really evade that long enough to because it's a very precise process that you have to build. So I don't know the answer to that. Clearly, they've kept him from building one so far, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a question of how do Iran's facilities hold up to this attack right now. Fordo is the big one that's buried in the mountain. Will that survive this round of attacks? Will it survive intact? Will enough nuclear scientists be safe afterwards? Once we know the answers to those questions, then we'll know whether or not Iran has the resiliency to carry out a militarization of its nuclear program, because they have many of the pieces already in place. They're very close on a technical level to having that breakout weapon. But it's a question of, one, can they break out in a way where they're not caught and destroyed? And then two, can they break out and test and then develop deployable nuclear weapons before they're destroyed? Because a deployable nuclear weapon, there are stages of that an airstrike can knock out a nuclear weapon if it's not armed and appropriately set up. And there's radiation from that, but it's not a nuclear explosion unless it's correctly established. And there's a reason, so that our nuclear bombers, when they crash, they don't set off a mushroom cloud. Right. So can the Iranians get there? The answer is it's not certain, because the Israelis' intelligence penetration of Iran is extraordinary. There are probably, in a place as large as Iran, safe places where even Mossad can't get to. Fordo is probably one of them. But as we watch this campaign unfold, it's possible. The Israelis, they gave us the pager attacks. They gave us, secret drone bases inside of the Iranian desert. If they have some other, trick up their sleeve that we haven't seen yet, it does suggest that Iran can't even sneak a nuclear weapon past the international community. But since we haven't seen that, we have to assume that Iran probably has that capability if they have the will. All
right. Well, look, Ryan, thank you so much. I introduced you as RANE's Middle East expert. Can you just give the quick 30 seconds on what RANE is for the audience? I just want to make sure people understand this, the source that we're talking with today.
Yeah, of course. RANE Network is a geopolitical advisory firm. We're mostly client-facing, although we have a consumer website where you can read our intelligence assessments, ranenetwork.com. And we, advise our Fortune 500 clients on geopolitical risks like US-Iran, as well as their own narrow specific interests in ways that are impacted by geopolitics. So everything from trade to US-Iran nuclear talks to Russia-Ukraine, that all falls under our purview.
All right. Well, thank you. And, Ryan, I kind of like to say when we finish up here that I hope I don't have you back on again in the near future, because it means obviously that things have quieted down. If they continue to escalate from here and things become more complex, I will let you know now that I will be asking you to come return and make sense of it for the audience. If it fits in your schedule, great. If not, we know you got a ton of demands on your time. But for folks that would like to follow you and your work in between your appearances here on this channel, where should they go?
I'm still on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm on Blue Sky. Just look up Ryan Bohl on any of those platforms. You'll be able to follow it. I post different things in different venues, of course. LinkedIn is probably the most comprehensive one.
All right. Well, Ryan, look, I can't thank you enough for this. Thank you so much for, again, dropping everything, giving us this real-time making sense of what's going on. Super fascinating, super scary at the same time. Again, we'll all hope that things unfold in the way in which, we all we hope where things de-escalate here. But whatever happens here, we'll continue to rely on you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, I appreciate it, Adam. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. And everybody else, thanks so much for watching.